Hello, my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Psychology Podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. All right, you guys, it is officially cold and flu season, and I moved to San Antonio, Texas, searching for year-round warm weather. And don't get me wrong, I totally found it, thank goodness. I mean, it was nearly 70 degrees Christmas morning. Unheard of, at least in Seattle, which is where I'm from. And don't get me wrong, okay, like it still got pretty chilly, like early mid-January. We did end up getting this like snowstorm, which was honestly just like a couple of flurries here in San Antonio, but it did get down to a whopping 29 degrees Fahrenheit. And like I said, that is nothing compared to Seattle weather, but it was still pretty chilly. Also, I do get cold really easily, like I'm anemic. So like all my anemics out there, you guys know what I'm talking about. We are always freezing. Okay, like to the point where I sleep with socks on and I am not afraid to admit it. Come for me if you want. But anyways, I'm also Salvadoran. So like that's why I moved to San Antonio, because Seattle was just way too cold for me. And although it gets chilly here, it is nothing compared to that. The need for warmer climate, it's just in my DNA. I need it. I yearn for it, essentially. But anyways, this whole like cold and flu season thing kind of reminded me of something. Like, did y'all know that there was a time when doctors would purposely induce fevers to cure mental illness? Yeah, well, this episode, we're covering fever cure, curing mental illness or accidental tuberculosis. Well, if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy and let's jump into it. Also, if it looks like my top is a pajama top, that's because it is. Okay, I just got back from the gym. It's late. It's dark out. Come for me, okay? After this, I'm probably going to head straight into bed, so might as well. All right, so fevers. Fevers as we know them today are one of the body's oldest and most primitive mechanisms for fighting infections. We know this as our adaptive immune system. The heat that a fever produces damages both the host and the invader, but it's often more damaging to the invader since a lot of the pathogens are sensitive to high temperatures. It's like taking us back all the way to high school biology. All right, so in the early 1900s, asylums were filled with patients suffering from an interesting form of psychosis that doctors weren't too familiar with at the time. It was all very new. They hadn't seen something like it before. They called this form of psychosis general paresis of the insane, or GPI for short. It was soon found that the cause of this psychosis was advanced syphilis. When syphilis is left untreated, the microorganism that caused the disease in the first place makes its way into the brain and produces symptoms that are often indistinguishable from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Well, since syphilis remained untreatable in the early 1900s, psychiatrists everywhere searched frantically for any way to reduce the symptoms experienced by the flood of GPI infected patients. So, with that, our main character for the day is Dr. Julius Wagner Jauregg, a Viennese physician who researched pathology in medical school, but then after graduation went on to work at a psychiatry clinic treating psychotic patients. Like pretty sharp turn there, but good for him. He found his calling. While he worked at the clinic, he observed a number of GPI patients because this was like really in right now, kind of. One day, he was faced with one of his most interesting GPI patients by the name of Hilda. And from my research, I understand that the name Hilda is a pseudonym kept for the patient's privacy, but we're going to go with Hilda because that's what the research tells us. So Hilda had been suffering from the mental damages of the disease, GPI, for over a year at this point. And out of nowhere, she came down with a fever that was completely unrelated to her syphilis. It turns out it was just a respiratory infection. Well, not just, but I mean, they viewed it as a could have been worse situation, all right? But interesting part happened right after her fever went down. After her fever subsided, Hilda woke up with a clear head and no lucid symptoms. By some miracle, her psychosis had just vanished. What made this case extremely interesting was that GPI was known to only progress in one direction, and that direction was down. Like, there was no way up after you got GPI, essentially. So Hilda's remission of her psychotic symptoms piqued Dr. Wagner-Jarrig's interest. He theorized that since her sanity had been restored immediately after her fever subsided, something about the fever itself must have been responsible. Could it be that the fever had somehow stunned or even killed the syphilis microorganism that damaged the brain? I mean, there was a lot to think and take into consideration at this point. This was the early 1900s, and at the time, we were lacking really any meaningful understanding of the mechanisms of how a fever works. But even so, Dr. Wagner-Jarrig came out with a very bold experiment. He aimed to test the effects of high temperatures on psychosis by infecting GPI patients with fever-producing diseases. That is quite the experiment. Like, it is bold to think of a doctor conducting that experiment today. Can you imagine back then? Oh my goodness. He started off by serving his patients a drink that had inside the microorganisms of the bacteria that causes strep throat. I've never had strep. Okay, side note / random fact about me, I rarely get sick. I got really sick last year after hanging out with a really close friend of mine. Thanks, Alex. He knows what he did, you know what you did. But before that, I hadn't been sick for over 6 years. Like, I never even got COVID. Knock on wood, like literally knock on wood, okay? But like, I don't know, it's just kind of crazy. I like to brag about my really strong immune system to people, and like, it kind of pisses some people off, but whatever. I'm happy, I'm proud of it. Like, exercise daily, eat your fruits and vegetables, and just like drink your tea, you guys, okay? Specifically, chamomile and green tea. Chamomile tea is really good for your immune system, and green tea is practically nature's Ozempic. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. Sorry about that little sidetrack there. My ADHD just kind of does that sometimes. But speaking of mental disorders, back to Wagner-Jarrig. So he basically drugged his patients, infecting them with strep throat. And not just any patients. He infected psychotic patients, as if these guys don't already have it bad enough, right? So get this. Wagner-Jarrig didn't just stop at strep throat. Like any good research study, he needed multiple variables. So using the same patients after the strep throat, he tried tuberculin, an extract from bacteria that causes tuberculosis. But wait, there's more. As if the strep and tuberculosis weren't enough, he also infected these poor psychotic patients with malaria. Bro, like, if you're like me and wondering where the fuck he even got access to malaria in a random psychiatric hospital in North America, you'd have to remember that this was in the early 1900s, okay? And what was happening in the early 1900s? That's right, World War I. Good job. So Wagner-Jarrig kind of had a pretty good supply of malaria readily available to him due to malaria-infected blood from soldiers returning home from war. Talk about properly using your resources. I wonder if he infected his patients with malaria because he knew he could easily get it, or if he found out he could easily get it and then decided to use it. Does it make a difference? I don't know. I think it does. Well, believe it or not, malaria was the one that eventually did it. After Wagner-Jarrig injected his GPI patients with the malarian parasites via an infected cocktail, the patients succumbed to the known fever that comes after being infected by malaria. Shockingly, but not surprising, shortly after succumbing to their malarian fever, the patients exhibited a dramatic improvement in their mental state. Fucking A. This is like how negative plus a negative equal a positive. You know what I mean? You take the psychosis, a negative. Add the disease-induced fever, another negative. And together you get an improvement in their mental health symptoms. A positive. I was never really good at math, okay? Like, I'm currently a PhD student, but in high school, I graduated senior year with a D in Algebra 2. And I'm pretty sure it's only because my math teacher felt bad for me, okay? Mr. Broshkoff at Henry M. Jackson High School in Mill Creek, Washington, if you're ever out there, just know that I think about you every so often, because if it weren't for you, I probably would not have graduated. And honestly, that D was a little too high of a grade for me. I did not deserve it. All right, back to Wagner-Jarrig. Again, I'm telling you, sometimes my ADHD just So the patients who previously behaved a bit bizarre and talked incoherently now seem to be composed and were able to converse pretty quote unquote normally. In fact, from the looks of it to Dr. Wagner-Jarek, some of these patients appear to have been cured of their syphilis entirely. Like all the ethical and illegal stuff around the experiment aside, this was pretty groundbreaking. Eventually, Dr. Wagner-Jarek went on to call this new method pyrotherapy. Pyro meaning fire in Greek. Get it? Fire, fevers. Very clever. So, after a few successful repetitions, pyrotherapy quickly became the standard treatment for GPI. Even though the idea of intentionally infecting mentally ill patients with malaria is a cause for ethical and legal concern, pyrotherapy was the very first effective treatment for severe mental illness. Period. You really have to think about it, okay? Because never before in the history of psychiatry and psychology had any medical procedure been shown to even alleviate psychosis, let alone cure it. GPI specifically, given that it comes from an already debilitating disease such as syphilis, as soon as someone was diagnosed with GPI, the only thing the future held for them was a permanent stay at the mental asylum where the person would live out their days waiting for the sweet relief of death. Speaking of death, it wasn't all a complete success though. It is estimated that about 15% of Wagner-Jarek's malaria-infected patients did die as a result of the fever. This is where it gets to a pretty shady area for opinions, you know? Like, yes, as a medical professional, it is never a good thing when any of your patients pass away. Ever. However, when taking certain details into consideration, one kind of, think about it. A time where any medical breakthrough was seen as a miracle. Okay, this was that time. And if you put it into a certain perspective, 15% is a pretty low number. I don't want to be that person, really, believe me. But do you guys see what I mean? I can't be the only one. And let me know down in the comments what you guys think. In the early 1900s, Dr. Wagner-Jarek's fever cure instilled hope that there might be other, more practical and safe ways to treat mental illness. This fever cure allowed those afflicted with a death sentence such as GPI to have the chance of returning to sanity. For some, this even meant being able to return home from the mental institution. Dr. Wagner-Jarek really was ahead of his time, and he was recognized for his achievements. In 1927, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the first ever Nobel Prize in Medicine in the field of psychiatry. Snaps all around for this diva, honestly. And as I was saying before, despite the ethical and legal concerns that we have now, today, for the early 1900s, I really believe the man was actually trying to make a positive change and help those poor psychos. He really was a pioneer in the field of psychiatry. You can't deny that. Throughout the 1920s, many psychiatrists attempted to apply pyrotherapy to other mental disorders apart from GPI. In asylums all around the country, patients with schizophrenia, depression, mania, and hysteria were soon infected with a wide variety of fever-producing diseases. Now, that is a sentence I never thought I would say out loud. It did get to a certain point where doctors were trying anything and everything. Some psychiatrists even went so far as to inject malaria-infected blood through the skulls of schizophrenic patients directly into their brains. I mean, talk about going from 0 to 100 real quick. It didn't take too long for the medical field to see that although pyrotherapy was groundbreaking, it wasn't exactly the cure-all that many hoped it would be in the end. Though fever cure did mitigate the psychotic symptoms that came with GPI, it proved kind of useless against all other forms of mental illness. This being the schizophrenia, depression, mania, and hysteria. Because the thing we have to remember is that GPI was a psychotic symptom of syphilis. Without the syphilis, there would be no GPI. So since other disorders were not caused by pathogens such as the ones that caused GPI, there was nothing for the fever to kill except occasionally, about 15% of the time, the patient themselves. As research into syphilis itself continued through the medical field, we began to see a decrease in GPI. Soon enough, with the development of penicillin and other medical breakthroughs, GPI is kind of a thing of the past now. Kind of. Not to say it is, because venereal diseases are still very much a thing to present day. Speaking of which, please be careful out there, you guys. Practice safe sex and get tested. It is needless to say, but fever cure is no longer used today to treat any form of psychotic symptoms, including its number one, GPI. Well, thank you so much, my curious cats, for tuning into today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please follow the podcast on Instagram for all episode news and updates. And please be kind and share the podcast with all your friends. The support is immensely appreciated and loved. You have no idea. As always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay safe, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.